You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board.
Hello and welcome to Influencers, our marketing and communications podcast here at the Conference Board. I'm Denise Dahlhoff, Senior Researcher at the Conference Board, and today I'm talking with Peter McGraw, a marketing professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and an expert on emotions and behavioral economics. For more than a decade, Peter studied how humor works, and most recently, he started researching a new underexplored topic, singles. And that's the topic of today's episode, Single Insights, the Science of Solos. Welcome, Peter, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Denise. Yes, a big shift indeed. And good news is that I'm better at being single than I am at being funny.
Got it. With this new stream of research, you have put the spotlight on singles, a minority that companies haven't paid too much attention to overall, according to your work. It's a very interesting topic in terms of singles' distinct needs, preferences, behaviors, their role in society, and also the business opportunity for companies, both from a marketing and employment perspective. So, to give us all some background on the singles market in the US, can you tell us a little bit about how big the market is and also how the singles segment can be described in terms of gender, age, maybe race and ethnicity, and any other descriptors that you might have?
Indeed, yes. And so it's interesting to hear singles referred to as a minority, in part because they're making up nearly half of the adult population in the United States. There are 128 million single adults. And so nearly one out of every two adults are single. That is the same in the workforce. So whether you're thinking about singles as potential customers or as potential employees, just know how huge this group is. And it's one that is growing. So at one point in time, 30, 50 years ago, they were distinctly a minority. And that's no longer the case. And yet the world still treats people as at least eventually going to be marrying, if not already so. This trend is quite striking. So not only are one in nearly every two people single, 50% of those singles are not interested in dating or a relationship in the first place. So they're not on a fast track to get partnered up. Pew Center study suggests that 1 in 4 millennials will never marry. So that's 25% of millennials. And 28% of households are a single occupant. And that's actually the most common form of household in the United States. That number is high as 50% in some Northern European cities, such as Stockholm, Sweden. And as you might imagine, overwhelmingly solo occupants are also single. Singles tend to be slightly more women, especially at older ages. Singles, the African American community tends to be disproportionately single, as well as the LGBTQ plus community. Singles tend to live in more urban places. And so it's actually hard to describe this group in some monolithic sense. It's incredibly diverse, both with regard to ethnicity and age, lifestyle, place in life, development, etc., containing 18-year-old college kids all the way up to the oldest person in the world, who's currently a 108-year-old woman. And so this is a big, broad, diverse group of people who do share one thing in common, and that is they're unpartnered.
Very interesting. So maybe, and it's fascinating that this segment is so diverse, but maybe that's one of the reasons why companies haven't been as focused on this market. So you're talking about this also being a potential growth opportunity for companies. And so if you had to point to some product or services categories where companies could particularly improve their targeting of singles, which ones would those be?
Yeah, so I think to step back and to make the case for why singles are overlooked and undervalued is probably important in the first place. And that is that there's this tendency to just expect singlehood to be this liminal space, this temporary space, as people are on this journey. And in part because companies tend to be made up by, especially more senior people who are the decision makers, by people who have made the journey, by people who are partnered. And there's a lot of just sort of legacy thinking that exists within organizations that are very focused on families and the needs of families. Now, once you start to step back and think that singles have different sets of needs, it opens up opportunities to serve a group that is frankly not focused on very much. So, one thing that's just very clear is that single people tend to do things alone more than partnered people. So I have data on this. For example, 58% of singles go to the movies alone, at least at some point of time, compared to 25% of married people. Well, if you think about it, how is it that you go about selling tickets? How do you go about blocking seats? How do you go about communicating with singles? Restaurants overwhelmingly are focused on diners in groups. There's a really great case study in this. Ichiban, which is a ramen noodle restaurant, a Japanese restaurant, which actually has 6 locations in the United States, has focused on solo dining. And they do so in a way they talk about solo diners being able to focus on the food. But frankly, that's just a polite excuse, right? So they talk about being able to focus on your food versus other types of things. But really what it is a win-win situation. So Ichiban has these single booths that are sort of private. There's very minimal interactions with your server. But what they have discovered is not only are there lots of people who dine casually. In the United States, 64% of singles dine alone, at least on occasion, compared to 41% of married people. Solo diners turn tables faster. So a solo diner spends 20% less time at the restaurant. And so Ichiban has created a place that is welcoming to a solo diner. So when they walk in, they don't go, "Oh, just one," right? Where the person's having to feel a little bit bad that there's no one with them. And so they're creating an experience that is excellent for the solo diner, but it also benefits the company because they serve more people in the same period of time. A win-win situation by looking at the needs of solos.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating also because it seems like you mentioned the coupled or the married people that are also once in a while dining by themselves. So, this restaurant seemed to also then open up new opportunities with that group, on the occasions when married people dine by themselves. But if you have other examples, good examples of companies that are targeting singles,
Yes,
that would be awesome to hear.
I do. And, at one point in time, it was very difficult to find anything. And we're now starting to see organizations pick up on this. So one that I discovered recently is the wireless carrier Visible. And Visible has this ad campaign targeted for singles who want the benefit of a family plan. So if you have a family, you can sign up your family for this wireless carrier and get a discount. But if you're a single person, that option's not available to you. Well, Visible has realized there are a lot of single people who feel disenfranchised. They don't get that chance for a discount. And so Visible offers a plan in which you can sign up your friends. And so they say team up with friends instead. And they have a series of very cheeky commercials that says you don't have to start a family to get this benefit.
That's very creative.
Indeed. Yeah. And they're very fun. They're very fun advertisements. Another place that you're seeing this, and this is both in the United States, but especially on an international scale, is the rise of micro living. So a sort of new form of apartment building that features much smaller apartments, a smaller footprint, and then bigger common areas, more communal spaces. These buildings are designed for singles, right? So you're not sharing a space with anyone. You're living on one income. And so you can use a smaller space well, and it lowers the price. And then when you want to venture out into the space, there are other people that you can interact with.
Sounds like the best of both worlds. You have your private space, but you still have the community nearby that you can interact with.
Indeed.
Super interesting.
Yes.
And so, what I'm also curious about is whether single spending behavior differs in some way from that of their coupled peers. Like, do they have more or less purchasing power, for example?
So I appreciate this question because it's such a difficult question to answer. And so I'll preface this by saying that any marketer who is considering targeting singles, chances are, first of all, you already have single people who are using your product or service. They may be using it differently. They may have different needs that they're using it for, but you already have single customers and you're probably not communicating with them very well. But to do that, you have to understand the nature of your specific demographic. As I said earlier, you can't treat all single people as the same. They're at different stages in their life. They have different needs. They do, however, have some commonalities. And one of those commonalities is that they are often the sole decision maker when it comes to their consumption. There is not someone else who is in charge of the purse strings. I'll say that again. There's not someone else who's in charge of the purse strings. There's not someone else who's going to be angry if you make the wrong decision. This is a solo decision financed by the person who's doing the consumption. Singles also spend their money on different things. So yes, they spend their money in the same ways on housing and food. They have the same kind of needs in that sense, but they often have a much smaller footprint, for example. They often don't have as many obligations to spend compared to someone who has children, for example. And thus much of their spending is non-discretionary, right? There are needs that must be met that are not optional. Singles have a lot more autonomy in terms of their decision making, but also in terms of their choice. So they have more discretion. After that, it becomes hard to say exactly what's the case. But in general, singles may spend their money a little bit more on things like self-care, on entertainment, on doing things that are going to be sort of enjoyable and social because they're not as likely to be hunkered down in the suburbs in a big house with the needs of a family to be met. I can give you an example also of how segmentation and targeting matters. So I ran a survey on Singles Day. So Singles Day came out of China. It's on 11/11, on November 11th. The ones are representative of single people. And I asked a wide array of singles how they would celebrate Singles Day. Would they try to find someone to go on a date with or make a romantic connection? Would they celebrate their singlehood? Would they engage in self-care and self-reflection, appreciating their life? And what I found was that there were sort of two general types of singles. The singles who desperately want to be coupled up, the hopeless romantics of the world. And those singles said, I would use the day for romance, to pursue romance. The other group, which I call solos, these are people who are, they may or may not be interested in partnering up, but they're very comfortable with their singlehood. They feel like a complete person. That group was much more likely to say, I would engage in self-care. I would celebrate my singlehood alone or with other people. And so not only are there demographic differences within the group, but there are also psychographic differences within the group. How singles feel about singlehood. Are they proud of it? Are they comfortable with it? Is partnering an option or optional, or must it happen, or life is incomplete?
That's super interesting, the psychological differences. So the people that are still searching and hoping to find the right person, and the others that are completely comfortable. In fact, that was going to be one of my questions, whether there's any stigma today about being single, or maybe, the second group sounds more like they are proud of being singles. And also, what is societal's perception about singles, specifically in the US? I mean, you mentioned, the world is so focused on, in many ways, in many categories, thinking that families, for example, are a default. So, what do societies currently think of singles, or what's their perception?
Again, a complex question, which I appreciate, Denise. Um, so I like to say it's never been better. It's never been a better time to be single. And the reason for it is this rise of single living. So there have never been more single people on the planet in an absolute number and in a relative number, at least in recent history. And when I say recent history, like thousands of years. And the feelings are mixed. So this is a stigma that has been it's been sort of slowly eroding over time. And some of it is just because of the sheer size of the demographic. But it's more than just that. It's a sort of recognition that there's not just one way to live your life and to live it remarkably, that there are multiple paths to living a remarkable life, as I like to say. And what we're starting to realize is, with the help of the behavioral sciences, this notion that marriage is overprescribed. For example, there is no data, there's no evidence that getting married makes you happy beyond the blip of time in which your wedding is occurring. That is, there's a slight rise in people's life satisfaction as their wedding approaches, and then it returns back to their baseline. That goes against a common narrative that marriage makes you happy, that you're going to have this blissful experience forever after. And so some of it is that information is getting out there. But then some of it is also that I like to say that singlehood begets singlehood. That is, when I was young, I knew one guy in my neighborhood who was a bachelor, and he was in his late 30s. He drove a Trans Am and he grew marijuana in his backyard. And my sister and I thought he was weird. But nowadays, I think he would be my friend. And the point is this, is that now where I look, especially if you live in an urban area, there are lots of single people living a life in which they're thriving. And so you have role models and you have mentors and you have people to do things with, versus a time in life where if you were that guy, everyone around you was married. Everyone around you was building a family, and it was easy to feel like there was something wrong with you. Moreover, you can't talk about the rise of singles without talking about the rise of women. Part of the reason that we're finding singles and singles doing better than ever is because in the United States in particular, and actually in any real developed country, women are having better access to education and economic opportunities. And it just so happens, when you give women education and you give them a chance to have a job in which they can live on their own, some of them opt out of getting married. This has certainly been accelerated by the access to birth control, that you no longer are finding yourself pregnant and having to get married. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. So even in collectivistic cultures like Japan and South Korea, you're seeing more people opting out of this default of having a family. So there's a group on my podcast Solo that I did an episode on the Han jokes of South Korea, which is this group of young creatives who are opting out of traditional South Korean culture. They're more likely to be artists and foregoing the corporate jobs or the government jobs. They're more likely to live on their own, and they're eschewing traditional marriages. What's fascinating is that South Korean businesses have honed in on this group and are doing a really good job of serving them in the way that American businesses are not serving singles. And so, with the exception of places like India, some of the Middle East, China, you're seeing this sort of rise of single people opting into being single. Now, in some of those other places, you have plenty of single people, but they're single not by choice, but rather by chance. That is, there are 35 million extra Chinese men in China with little chance of finding a wife. And so this is actually, in many ways, I paint this as um, both a very optimistic and exciting development, but it also has another side to it, which is very real challenges when it comes to people who want to be partnered but can't, and thus the complexity around your question.
Hmm. Super interesting, those societal changes, and also that the level of employment, that sort of seems to correlate with, singlehood, the economic independence that it gives you. But, I found this also really interesting about the stigma, because thinking of companies, especially marketers targeting singles, have you come across any labels for this group? Like what kinds of terms do, if any, do marketers use to address singles?
Yeah. So, to my knowledge, I don't know this. I can offer up some that may help. So, again, we have there's this sort of notion of what I call single by chance and single by choice, right? So, which is essentially this notion of, remember, half of American single adults are not interested in dating or a relationship at the moment. And they are interested in doing other things. So for many of them, they just have more important things to do, right? They are building a business. They are getting an MBA. They are working on themselves. They are digital nomads and traveling the world. And so they just don't have the time or the energy for a relationship, traditional or otherwise. There are the singles by chance. These singles by chance, some of them are struggling. They're really in a bad place. They have a hard time maintaining healthy relationships. Maybe they live in a place where they don't have good opportunities to meet someone. Others are single by chance because they don't want a traditional relationship, and they're living in a world where most people want it, and they're having a hard time matching up. You can almost call this like single by mismatch. And so the work that I've been doing um, takes this sort of psychographic approach and lays it on top of that. So there's sort of four types of singles as I see it. There's the someday group, right? These are the hopeless romantics. These are the people who have listened to the love songs and watched the rom-coms and read the Jane Austen novels, and they want to find their person. They feel incomplete. And as a result, they are sort of traditional thinkers, and they want to live kind of traditional, conventional lives. And life won't be complete until they find their person, their ride or die, their partner in crime. The other group are more what I call solo in orientation. They feel complete, and they may or may not want someone else. So the next group is the just may group. I just may find my person. I call them hopeful romantics. It would be nice to find that person, but life goes on. I'm not sitting around waiting for this to happen, and if it doesn't happen, that's okay. These folks are focused often on personal growth, but not personal growth to catch or capture someone, but personal growth for themselves. The next group is the no way group. No way am I interested in this at the moment. And these folks are focused on other things. And then the last group, probably the smallest group, is the new way group. This is a group who would welcome a relationship, but do so in a sort of non-conventional kind of way. So maybe they would live apart together with a partner. They're not interested in merging their lives. And so this is one orientation by which to think about how singles are living their lives. And it's incomplete, yes, but it gives you a sense because it correlates with a whole host of other values and beliefs. And so in terms of designing products, designing services, and especially with regard to communicating with these singles, You're going to capture some of their attention and others not so much. Of course, my argument is just try to capture their attention in general, and you're already going to be at an advantage compared to your competition who's only speaking to married people and their families.
Mhm. And those labels, by the way, the psychographic segmenting within the singles market is also really interesting from a communicator's perspective, because then you can, of course, it's hard. There are so many different, varieties, but you could, focus your messaging better to these specific psychological needs, or how people's emotions.
I'll give you an example of this, if I may. So recently, Uncle Ben's did a rebrand into Ben's Originals, and they have rolled out an advertising campaign, introducing this new brand. And one of the things that's been striking about it is that they have been focused on single moms, for example, and showing singles who have roommates. Now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, you would have never seen a scene like that in a commercial. It would have been a mom serving a husband and two children. And so something as subtle as just representing single people in their different permutations is useful. That's there. Bounty, the paper towel company, just recently had a commercial showing a sort of grandma type, with her grandson or her son while she's swiping on an app. Oh, he looks nice. Oh, he looks nice. And of course, someone spills water and it's creeping up towards the iPad, and Bounty saves the day and perhaps saves her love life. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. So, for example, ice cream. One of the things that's striking about ice cream is that ice cream consumption is actually rather high in the winter. And people often use it as a way to sort of soothe themselves and a way to sort of reward themselves as they're kind of nesting. Well, good luck finding an advertisement that shows a happy single person on a Friday night, eating some ice cream, drinking a glass of wine, having a nice night solo. And yet, I have to imagine that there are many singles who do that, and there's a missed opportunity to be the brand for those people.
Those are super interesting examples, and clearly show that many marketers seem to be at the pulse of the times. But I also wanted to ask you, apart from the marketing world and targeting customers, you have also found that companies' policies for employees tend to focus more on coupled employees, including those with children. Can you tell us a little bit more what you have found and what the issue is, and also how could companies address this to also be more inclusive, maybe, or considerate of single employees?
Yeah, so the challenges are the same, right? So organizations have major challenges, right? Competition that's out there, but also competition for talent. How do you acquire and how do you keep your most talented individuals? And yet, HR departments and too many managers are acting like it's 1950 still, rolling out family friendly policies. And yet, as we talked about earlier, nearly half of the workforce is single, and a large proportion of them will remain so. And to only have family friendly policies is alienating to perhaps half of your workforce. And so, what better way to acquire and retain this kind of talent than to have more equitable treatment? And so, the work that I've been doing has found that singles are concerned with, I'd say, three things. The first one is just simply equal treatment. That if you are a single person in a workplace, you are often asked to pick up the slack for your married counterparts. You end up working the big holidays more often. You're asked to work extra shifts. Your married employees can run an errand because they have to go pick up their child at daycare, but your personal endeavors are not highly as valued. actually recently had a conversation with a pilot who was in the Navy, and this was during the Iraq War, and they had to send some fighter pilots to Iraq, and they asked for volunteers. And the commander said, if there's no volunteers, this is the ranking system. And the top 4 people out of the 20 people listed were all single. And so, by virtue of not having a wife or a husband, put you at greater risk in this particular situation. And so just simply asking managers to be considerate that the personal endeavors of singles are important and aren't necessarily trumped by the personal endeavors of married people. I would say to go as far as instituting rule-based, I would go as far as saying you should institute rule-based decision-making when it comes to assigning shifts, assigning vacations, assigning holiday work, and so on, rather than personal judgments which may be biased. Create a market in which people bid for these kinds of things, and then you can end up sorting people based upon their preferences rather than based upon their partner's status or not. The second thing is that benefit packages are overwhelmingly focused on married or soon to be married employees. So, for example, there's already a differential benefit when a married person, especially with a family, gets hired versus a single person, because the married person gets health care, not just for themselves, but for their spouse and for their children. Moreover, in the United States, there may be maternity leave that's present, but that's the only leave. Maybe there's parental leave. Yet, singles can't take advantage of that, but they still have needs for leave. For example, singles are more likely to be the sole caregiver to an elderly parent. And this simply happens because mom gets sick or dad gets sick, has a fall, has some problem, and the siblings call each other and says, who's going to take care of dad? And the sibling who's working full time has a partner and has children, says, I have no bandwidth. I don't have any more space to do this. Can you do this for me? And the single sibling steps up and does this. I had this experience myself where I had to do this with my mother. In hindsight, I should have taken family leave for this. In many organizations, there's no option for family leave. You have to quit your job or you have to go without pay or without resources in order to take care of mom or dad. Moreover, in the case of LGBTQ plus community in particular, these folks tend to live with their family of choice. Sometimes they are alienated from their family. And so their friends, their family of choice, they get sick also. They have challenges also, and there is no recourse for them. So what I argue is that the really cutting edge organizations should implement a sort of cafeteria style benefits package where you get to choose the benefits that are most likely to work for you. So I've done some surveys with this with like a point system, and you find that singles and non-singles make different choices with regard to their health care, with regard to leave, perhaps sabbaticals, or even something like pet insurance, which is appreciative. And it's just as simple as creating an equitable situation in which the employer is spending the same amount of resources regardless of relationship status. But people get to choose the resources that are best for them. And then the last thing is hours and schedules. Singles don't need to live on a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 work schedule that is so common in the world, because they don't have a partner necessarily who's on the same schedule, because they don't have children who are in school who are on a similar schedule, because there's not daycare that they need to worry about that's on a similar schedule. They can work remotely. They can, as I said earlier, I talked about digital nomads. Overwhelmingly, digital nomads are single. And so whether it be flexible hours, remote work, singles and couple people. Even the location for offices can be different among those. And just recognizes that by loosening up some of these standards, you can then recruit more broadly. For example, suppose that you're interested in having a hybrid work environment. Well, you can now employ someone who lives in a different city, and maybe they come into the office 1 week a month. Well, singles have a lot more flexibility to be able to do that than someone who is partnered up. And so recognizing that these can be even recruiting tools for a broader array of people.
This is so interesting because it sounds to me it's not a big challenge to change the policies in the sense of thinking up something new, because essentially all these sort of services offered or benefits offered are available, but they are currently not maybe as accessible to singles. So it might just be more, taking that for companies, taking that perspective of a single employee and just, slightly tweaking their policy. So super interesting, Peter. Thank you so much for sharing all your interesting insights today about your research on singles with us. And thank you as well to our listeners for joining us today. We'll see you on the next episode of Influencers.
Cheers.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.